Instituto Tecnológico Autónoma de Mexico, ICAM, where he received his bachelor's in business administration. Also from UNAM, where he studied his graduate degree in economics, and also was a professor at the University of Anáhuac in economics during 1980. The KAHAN family, as I mentioned, have 70 years in the automotive industry, in particular Chrysler products and dealerships. Jack also has a distinction of the fellow that introduced Domino's Pizza into Mexico, as well as he and his brothers, the first 8 McDonald's franchises in Mexico City. So you're going to get a little feel of a real entrepreneur that's done a little bit of everything. He is the president of Grupo Multiplo, as well as he's our esteemed president of our Mexico City chapter in Mexico City of our chamber. He is on the board of the Consejo de Desarrollo Social de Ciudad de México, as well as chairman of the board of trustees for the Natural History Museum, a museum that you can't miss.
City of Washington, the capital of the United States, and having the opportunity to talk about our entrepreneurial experiences in Mexico City. Of course, there's no doubt that with all these numbers of Mr. De La Calle has given to us this morning, we are going to the last part, the very last part of this millennium, and we better have our eyes open. First of all, I have to say that I'm a product of this century. I'm a product also of a family that immigrates in the early century to Mexico, coming out from Europe, escaping from different wars and revolutions that there were going on in Russia. And I am very happy that they took the challenge to take the boat and go to Mexico on their way to the United States, because the rest of the family ended not very far from here in Waterbury, Connecticut. But because of destiny, we ended up in Mexico. And of what I was able to talk with my father at that time, because he passed away, was that every time that you are entering into something big in your life, you have to keep the enthusiasm. Enthusiasm and spirit is what drives you. And believe me, since I was born in 1954, I like to tell you that 1954 was a year of a devaluation in Mexico. And so I'm also product of different devaluations that has happened in my country. And I needed to focus and stay tuned on how to take the opportunities out of the devaluations themselves. To tell you the truth, what we were envisioning for the 1990s have just had a late takeoff. Why a late takeoff? Because we believe that Nafta will change our entrepreneurial way of thinking. And it should have taken place in the beginning of the 90s, and it will take place but a little bit later on in the 90s. But that will set up the tune of what is our responsibility of being entrepreneurs for the next millennium. And that sounds really interesting, and probably the beginning of a good history to tell to our children. Talking about my children, when we decided to move to the United States in another devaluation in 1982, because we saw that, in 1982, yes, we saw that the banking institutions were getting nationalized, and we say, hey, this was not written in any program. So how our businesses are going to run with a national entity as of the banks. So I said to my wife, now is the right time to go to the United States and see what other means and ways of doing business are here. And what drove me here is the freedom of entrepreneurship, the freedom of doing business. And I must tell you that it was hard to take this decision, but it was also very hard to say, I learned in the United States, and now we are coming back to apply in Mexico, what we learned in California. Okay? So that decision led me to have a different way of doing business also in my country. Not only that, but we started to do NAFTA, or free trade agreement, in my own house, because one of my sons, the youngest one, was born in the States. So I needed, like Al just said, to be not only bilingual, but also bicultural, in order to understand my own family, my own family. I must say that from the things that I remember of talking to the prior generation that was before me in Mexico, was that tough times have always been in our history, but tough people always make it. I remember my father said in 1936, before the oil was nationalized, that he couldn't sell a car. But the way that he was selling cars at that time was that he had to come and bring them down from Detroit City to Mexico City. And it took him 18 days for the fleet of 14 cars to come down. He told me that he came to Washington to pull out permits, and he needed to come and stay behind a counter for days in order to get those permits. Well, that obviously has changed. I hear today of many fellow entrepreneurs in Mexico that because of NAFTA, and by getting into the NAFTA now, our government has done great efforts to simplify our ways of exporting in Mexico. And they don't have to tell me. I come and visit with them in our commercial trips, and I see how close Bancomex, how close NAFI is with us and works and tries to get us introduce our products into to the United States. Very different from when in 1982, when I went to California, I tried to introduce products to the United States, and all of a sudden when I had the buyer in the United States, I called up Mexico, and they told me that the production that was dedicated to fulfill that order was going to fulfill our domestic market, and they left me hanging. Okay? So I at that time didn't understand why we were not having that export mind. And believe me, today I have the great privilege to tell you that we are able to talk about commitment, we are able to talk about delivery on time, we are able to talk about quality. And I am very happy that has happened to me in this age, because that gives me the view of not only cater myself into the domestic market and bring out franchises like Al just said, we brought McDonald's and we brought Domino's Pizza, but also to cater my efforts to see what can we do in terms of exporting and how to do things that come out of NAFTA. when we had the experience of bringing McDonald's into Mexico and Domino's Pizza, of course, McDonald's was not me, was a nephew of mine, that he was chosen among 1,000 people that applied to be the joint venture partner in Mexico. And it was very nice because it was after the 1982 devaluation where it seems that our horizon was narrowing, and all of a sudden McDonald's was eager to do business in Mexico, and in 1984 he opened up the first McDonald's, and since then he opened 20 McDonald's. But there is always a cultural shock, there is always a cultural barrier between two countries that they have lived very, very close to each other, but very far of constant communication. I can't remember, just to tell you one thing, of what has happened with McDonald's, that at the first week that we opened up in McDonald's in Mexico, we needed to work, to pay our working elements, the people, we needed to pay on an hourly basis. And the unions there didn't know how to handle the hourly basis. Okay? So McDonald's got closed for 2 or 3 weeks until we got them to understand that this was based on productivity. So just to tell you briefly, any kind of move that the entrepreneurs are doing while we are building bridges, we are facing difficulties in our cultural environment. But that doesn't stop us of doing business and be enthusiasts. I happen to also be in the meetings that Dr. De La Calle just said of negotiating for the Mexican sector of the automotive industry. And believe me, I remember one day in Dallas that being in the cuarto de al lado, in the room that was next to the authorities, we were asked about things and about data that we didn't have at that time to make a wise decision of how we would be prepared to negotiate with NAFTA. But it was our entrepreneurial common sense that led us through that particular moment. And at that time, I made some notes that last night that I was talking to my wife whether to share it with you or not. She said, well, you might as well know how we thought before NAFTA and how do we think now. So I wrote these couple of bullets and I say that, of course, I thought that with NAFTA we would our country would have new opportunities for expansion, the economy. We will have a wider extension for our exports, and we will set marks with non-precedents. We will have growth together with productivity, and most of all, everything, a new set of drawings will be drawn for an equal distribution of our national income. The challenges that NAFTA will impose are also opportunities. In the framework of the transition, sometimes we will have to recognize the different sizes of the economies between these three partners. But I always was sure, and I am still sure, that this society will give us time to conduct business in equal basis. And I'm a firm believer of that. And as an entrepreneur, I thought at that time, and it's happening today, that we will have to think global and not local. that is a new thing that we are facing, because when I was coming to this to this seminar, to this congress talks, I started to try to get my memory refreshed in statistics, and I got in front of my internet and I started to pull out a massive chunk of information that it took me about 6 or 7 days in my office to get away and say, Jack, you don't need that much information to convey what is your entrepreneurial feelings about what is happening. And that is absolutely true. For statistics and for keeping track of how the things, how much we export and how much we import, we can consult the internet every day. But the people, like the people that work in the government, and the people like me, small entrepreneurs in Mexico, are the ones that make the changes. And we have to come here and have the spirit prevail. And just be explicit enough to tell you how happy we are that a new means of communication in the trade business have opened. And it's only upon us to keep those means of communication open. NAFTA is more than keeping balances. NAFTA goes to themes like environment. And believe me something, as a Mexican citizen, I was never aware that the environment was so important to conduct business. And that is why my family and I, we recommend among ourselves to be much closer into the environment issues. And that has changed also my entrepreneurial point of view, because within my boundaries, I was able to make up a project of how to clean the air in the Mexico City area. Of course, that is something very hard to achieve, but I started to study the different causes of this, and I got to understand that the automotive industry was the one that was blamed for 75% of the total pollution in the city, where we cannot sometimes get rid of colds and of nose dripping. So I said, let me do this right. Let me work together with the American government in order to have a good assessment and compare the figures. And we got the figures out of the Denver Institute. And also, let me start doing what I am envisioning for the future, which will be very important. Start doing lobbying in my own country as an entrepreneur. And that is foremost one of the greatest responsibilities that we have among us in Mexico. The entrepreneurial society has to start doing the proper lobbying with our authorities, so the authorities know what we want to achieve before we put it in place. Let me finish by just saying our history states that our country, like Mexico, has always been able to convert challenges into opportunities. And that's why we are here now, to close these ties and to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. City Oscar Espinosa is to actually try to get the older cars off the streets. And as you know, in Mexico City, the license number, if you have the last number, if it's 3 or whatever it might be, a certain day of the week you can't drive it, so that they try to lower the pollution that way. His program is to try to get the old ones off, and if you sell your old one, or trade it in and get a newer one with the catalytic converters, etc., then you'll get a license plate that doesn't have the number that applies to a day that you don't have to drive, so you can drive all of them. It's starting to work. That's entrepreneurship at its best. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to... He's kind of recycling the cars that pollute that he sells. Now he's trying to fix them up, you see.
Always a market behind it.
I'd like to introduce our
educational opportunities was what was going to bring us to a better quality of life. And we've been in the meatpacking business and food processing business for 50 years. We sell to chains like McDonald's, we sell to chains like Whataburger and others. And so listening to your story was something that kept me completely focused on what you said. And I think you hit it on the head when you said that enthusiasm and spirit was what drove you and your family to the success and the successful entrepreneurship that you shared with us. And I think that I want to say to you that if there is anything we can do for you in Congress from my office, that we pledge to work very closely to be able to duplicate your story not once but 100 times with people from both sides of the river. Mexico is very dear to my heart, and of course why the United States gives so much importance to China maybe is the fact that they have 1.2 billion people. But truthfully, we are so much closer to Mexico. Transportation rates are much more favorable, and thus making it easier for us to trade with one another. But again, I want to commend you because you were able to take challenges and convert them to opportunities in spite of the recessions, in spite of the devaluation of the currency. And I think that we ought to take your story and find a way of canning it so that we can sell it and make a lot of money. Thank you.